What follows is a speech given to the 15th Party Congress of the CPSU in 1928. Its author is Clara Zetkin, a German revolutionary and representative of the KPD within the Comintern. On behalf of the Executive Committee of the Communist International, I extend our warmest greetings to this Congress along with our sincerest hopes for its success. We fully recognize the profound historical importance of your work, both now and in the future. This Congress must decisively separate the unwavering, unified core of the Leninist Party from those who hesitate and question Lenin's path. These individuals have, through their own actions, lost the right to be a part of our esteemed Communist Party. The Congress will need to confirm the decision, which has already been overwhelmingly supported by the vast majority of party members. We have closely observed the discussions within the party. Contrary to the opposition's claims, the results of these discussions are not due to suppression by the bureaucratic apparatus. Rather, the decisions made by the party members demonstrate the maturity and growth of Lenin's Communist Party. The people rightly condemned the actions of certain party members. We still vividly recall the grand demonstration during the October days. This was not a typical protest like those seen in Western Europe. It was, in fact, a triumphant march of workers who saw themselves as the builders of a great socialist state. The demonstration on the 10th anniversary of the October Revolution showcased the unwavering faith of the working class in its own revolutionary strength and the broad masses' confidence in their great leaders, the Leninist Communist Party and its Central Committee. The masses have shown the world that they are the bearers of a victorious, creative force. They have demonstrated their unshakable belief in the ironclad unity of the Leninist ranks. Comrades, the achievements of your party will be recorded in the annals of human history, not only as the party that led the proletariat to its October victory, but also as the leader in the successful construction of socialism. While we currently see only the initial stages of this construction, these first steps are so monumental that nothing can compare. However, it is precisely the magnitude of these first steps which set even greater tasks for the future, requiring complete and absolute unity of all forces of the working class and its vanguard, the party. Particularly now, as the imperialist world once again plots a blockade and another military invasion against the Soviet Union as it builds socialism, we must rally all our forces to the Communist Party with renewed energy. The opposition's behavior is either an act of sacrilege or sheer madness. It raises its hand against the great, immortal cause of socialist construction and threatens the unity of the party. The party masses, the vast majority of party members, rejected the opposition's proposals, and in response, the opposition outrageously appealed to non-party actors. This demonstrates that the opposition has abandoned Leninism and degenerated into social democracy, into Russian Menshevism. Now they speak of Thermidor and the degeneration of the party. The Executive Committee of the Comintern has closely monitored the opposition's activities, not only because they undermine the forces necessary for socialist construction, but also because their demoralizing influence is felt internationally. Here, we have a consolidated, strong, experienced, and unyielding party. In the West, we have young, growing communist parties being forged in their struggles. The opposition's work hinders the healthy development of these parties, both ideologically and organizationally. That is why we pay such close attention to the opposition's actions. We believe that now, since the leaders of the mutineers are collaborating with the most reactionary renegades and uniting with individuals expelled from the communist parties, there can only be one verdict against them: While the opposition's influence is minimal, every honest worker who might follow them is so precious to us that we must exert all our energy to ensure that not a single honest worker follows Souverine, Maslow, or the traitorous opposition. The opposition's activities only benefit the Kotskys, Hilferdings, and the like. This occurs at a critical historical moment when the working masses of the West are becoming more radical and gradually freeing themselves from their right-wing ideology. The opposition's activities are also harmful for another reason. They generate new hopes among imperialist groups of all kinds. These groups believe that once this fractious group demoralizes and weakens the party's firm ranks, it will be easier for them to crush the Soviet Union. Therefore, the Congress must unequivocally tell the opposition, we will not allow you to take another step in undermining the party, either ideologically or organizationally. We are firmly convinced that the Congress will make a decisive statement, not only for us here, but for all communist parties worldwide. The Congress will demonstrate the unbreakable unity of the Leninist Party, make a firm decision, and continue the construction of socialism with unwavering resolve. It is indeed painful that certain leaders, whom we once respected for their work, have abandoned the cause of socialist construction. Worse still, they hinder and obstruct it. However, as revolutionary fighters, we must not let sentimentality cloud our judgment. Our cause is greater than any individual. Let them go. The Leninist Communist Party and the working class, imbued with an iron will and tempered in the struggle under the party's leadership, will ensure the development of revolutionary consciousness, revolutionary will, and revolutionary action, filling us with absolute confidence in our ultimate victory. Lenin's party and the working class represent the historical force which will safeguard the Soviet Union, guarantee a period of peaceful construction, carry out socialist development to its completion, unite the workers of all countries in the struggle against capitalism, and achieve the victory of the world revolution.
Welcome to Stewards.
Hello, and welcome to Proles Pod, the Stalin Eras. I'm Justin, and the following is the narrative section of part 2 of the main series. Jeremy and myself will cover the years 1930 to 1934. We are calling this era Stewards of the Human Soul. For those of you who are familiar with Proles Pod, you have probably already noticed the marked difference between the Stalin Eras episodes and the format of those which came before. And for those of you joining us for the first time, welcome. If you're looking for an explanation of what we're trying to do and why, I would suggest listening to the introductory episode, if you haven't already. In addition to laying out our general plan, Martine also gives us a brief history of young Stalin, drawing on what information we have of his pre-revolution life. Each of these Stalin Eras episodes will, to one degree or another, build upon the last, in terms of themes and narratives, as well as the general trajectory of both Joseph Stalin and the socialist project to which he dedicated his life. For that reason, while we understand that some folks might be particularly interested in one era or another, we do suggest listening to the episodes in order so that you are better able to understand the complex tapestry of connecting threads which make up the big picture. One glaring omission you may notice in today's episode is that of the so-called Holodomor. We have chosen to exclude it because, 1, this is the only aspect of Soviet history we feel was covered well in the now infamous Rev Left Stalin episode, and 2, liberal scholars have, in the past 12 years or so, come to the consensus that the famine of the early 30s, while tragic, was not the product of intentional acts by Stalin himself or anyone else within the Soviet government. We will include references to texts which support this position in the show notes. In any case, next week, our wonderful comrade Jen, host of How the Red Was Won, aka Big Nasty on Twitter, will carry us through the discussion portion related to today's episode. And of course, you'll get a chance to hear some of Jen's thoughts and insights in our Patreon exclusive Backstage Pass. We hope you are enjoying the series thus far. And without further ado, let's get started.
A light fog hangs low and close to the hoarfrost on a collective farm near Khortytsia, Zaporizhia Oblast, in the southeastern part of the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic. New Year's Day, 1930. Ivan Yaroshenko greets the day with determined but tempered optimism. His eldest daughter, Polya, would be graduating soon and could help the family by sending money home. The second daughter, Nina, will go to the local polytechnic in the autumn. 2 daughters of a peasant graduating college. Ivan can hardly believe how much life has changed. At the turn of the last decade, half of his extended family was dying from typhoid. Polya had it for 2 weeks. People were starving. The Red Army took his jacket and gave him 50 pounds of flour. A generous exchange, considering that galvanized boots were selling for 50,000 rubles at market. In 1930, things were changing. The previous year, along with some aspects of collectivization, had been difficult. 1929's spring harvest started out tough, but by fall, things had leveled out. In September of that year, Ivan watched with indifference as the younger folk pressed hard on the kulaks to pay their taxes. The kulaks refused, so the young revolutionaries plundered their property and sold it to cover their unpaid share. As the year turned over, on that cold Wednesday morning of January 1st, Ivan Ivanovich Yaroshenko wrote in his diary,
Collectivization is going at a fast pace. The uncles are coming. Even if they don't want to, they are coming. I was paid 125 rubles from the farm. There's no money, but they have to pay.
Most items at the market were overpriced, but the tractors from the new machine and tractor stations were helping to reap a decent harvest. So much so that work was sparse, which meant money was also. The cooperative farms, or kolkhoz, didn't have any clothing items or manufactured goods, but the workers' government planned to bring them in soon. Over 700 miles away in Belarus, 15-year-old Arkady Poznyakov, another peasant, signed up for subscriptions to Around the World, a science fiction magazine. 3 editions and 2 books were supposed to come out per month, but everything was just a little disorganized. So Arkady had only received 4 magazines and 1 Jules Verne book in the past 2 months. On this day, though, a new book arrived. Arkady wrote in his diary,
The first pages of this book are occupied by the end of some novel. And then comes the novel Village in the Air, the end of which is not in this book. Today I started reading it. Nothing special happened in our family this past season. Dad, Mom, me, Sergei, and Kolya are alive and well, and only Sergei and I were a little ill. Once I earned 1 ruble for climbing the church roof and sweeping dirt off of it.
another 300 miles east from where Arkady was musing. Life in Moscow was very different. A girl who would have been his classmate if only they lived closer, Galina Zaitseva, had different worries at the dawn of 1930. When Galina went shopping a couple months ago, the store had no women's rubber galoshes, so she was forced to buy a men's pair. Now, as she wakes up on New Year's Day, she wrote in her diary about the dream she had the night before.
Ah, what a wonderful dream. I saw a school, only it wasn't my school. It's completely different. There's no classrooms, just normal rooms and long corridors. Our class listens to the teacher as he tells us to write a report about any animal or bird native to Australia. Everyone gets down to business, but I can't find a suitable bird or animal. So I go out into the street to look through the magazines in the stalls, but I still can't find anything specific to do the report on. All of my thoughts are occupied with SS alone. I see how his black eyes look at me affectionately and encouragingly. I'm no longer afraid that I don't have a report prepared. The moment comes when all of the students hold all of their essays out, enclosed in folders with beautiful drawings. I get up and I don't know where to look and what to answer. I feel terribly embarrassed, but at the same time, I see among the new reports my old one. But not a report, a small play that I wrote, for which I received praise earlier in the school year. Now I'm not so scared. I'm useful. I can do something. I feel like I'm filled with pride about my work. Everyone starts going home. I really want to go with SS, but I feel the other girl's eyes on me, and I'm ashamed to go ask him. Finally, I overcome myself and catch up to him. Quietly, barely opening my lips, I whisper, "Let's go." He nods his head at me and smiles, quite tenderly. He takes me by the elbow. We go outside. It's warm. The sun is shining so brightly that the joy consumes my soul. He turns to look at me and smiles. His teeth are even and white, fading under the gentle rays of the sun. I feel an inexplicable bliss. I want to close my eyes firmly and go towards this new, bright, wonderful life. My heart starts beating joyfully.
A few entries later, Galina pontificates on the intentions of SS, now named outright as Seryozha, and why he keeps looking at her.
I just can't figure out what this means.
In another part of town, 27-year-old Fedor Makarov is studying at the Pedagogical Institute. He has a habit of writing down his thoughts as they come to him, or quotes that he thinks are interesting, and leaving them around his desk. As the decade turns, he decides to clean it and bring it into...
For the edification of posterity, everything I have written down I place here in my diary. From the report of Comrade Svertsov at the Congress of Soviets of the Moscow region. The question before us is posed as follows. Either the socialist city will rebuild the village, or the village, under the leadership of the kulaks, relying on everything inert and routine in the village, will stop socialist construction. From Comrade Lenin. If we could give 100,000 first-class tractors tomorrow, the average peasant would say, "I am for communism." And my motto, "Love is a matter of free time."
Another part of the city. 35-year-old Boris Vladimirovich Alpers.
Gavronsky's film was made by cultured hands, but it gives the impression of a series of fragments, self-sufficient, directorial exercises. The author's goal is so unclear. His dependence on literary reminiscences is so strong.
Another, 42-year-old Zinaida Fosdick.
In the evening, we all went to Tabarosi for a seance. She allegedly went into a trance. It was very stupid and insignificant. All of the talk and advice, Leo Tolstoy, Tsar Nicholas with his family. We got nothing out of it, but only became convinced of the wretchedness of such a medium. Then they came to our place to drink valerian. We left late.
Muscovites, as they were called, weren't an aberration per se, but life in the stronghold of Western Russia is quite different from other cities around the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, especially on the western edge of the Ukrainian SSR in Kiev, where the Polish and Ukrainian nationalist influence dug its heels against the fierce winds of socialist change. In early April of the previous year, the Russian Soviet government passed an updated criminal code of the RSFSR, religious organizing, spearheading an anti-church campaign which would swiftly sweep across the entirety of the USSR. 60-year-old Vladimir wrote,
"Everyone is asked to sign prepared forms about the desire to close churches and remove bells. Yesterday, one of my friends told me how she signed the form at a parents' meeting. When I asked why she signed it, she said that she was afraid that her girl could be expelled from school if she'd not signed. Since she and her husband only have one child, it is necessary for the girl's life to be arranged as best as possible. Previously, when the church was not opposed, I did not go. Today, I went to an all-night vigil. I went to St. Sophia Cathedral. People, men, walked with their hats on and looked at the relics and icons on display. In one corner of the temple stood the son of a priest who had studied at a theological academy. He was giving an anti-religion speech. The anti-religious campaign. The Soviet government, along with many of its people, had a complicated relationship to religion. On the one hand, they understood the importance of the freedom of peoples to practice their beliefs. On the other, the Russian Orthodox Church, as well as many other religious institutions, poured money, resources, propaganda, and manpower into the White Army and any other groups who would oppose the godless Bolsheviks during the so-called Civil War and throughout Soviet history. Additionally, they sheltered militant counter-revolutionaries and refused the government taxes. In the early 20s and again during collectivization, the Central Committee of the CPSU fought desperately to redirect money and resources to relieve the suffering and starvation which was rampant across the country. Meanwhile, these institutions, who were believed to be reactionary, had incredible amounts of wealth. In many cases, wealthy clergy would only donate in return for a pledge of belief, or to fight against the Red Army. Looking back from today, the anti-religious campaign may seem overzealous or even superfluous. After all, as Marx argued in 1843, socialists ought not to attack religion directly. Rather, they should remove the social conditions which encourage the working class to turn to religion, the suffering which necessitates the salve. But there was an understanding amongst people of the former Russian Empire. Before the Great War, there was no real distinction between the Tsar and the Orthodox Church. Peter the Great abolished the office of the Patriarch during his reign, establishing the Tsar as the head of the country and the church itself. Village priests were often required to act as spies for the police. Perhaps the best rhetorical example of the corruption of the church was the fact that Leo Tolstoy was excommunicated because of his social views, while Rasputin, the lecherous Siberian monk, was not. During the Bolshevik Revolution, the church's patriarch, re-established during the time of the provisional government, pronounced a holy and solemn anathema against the Bolsheviks. When the Bolshevik government decided in 1921 to requisition the treasures of the church to help fund famine relief, the hostilities became even more fundamentally entrenched. After years of the aforementioned anti-Orthodox campaign, the Orthodox Church's influence was slowly but surely waning. However, this created a new problem for the ambitious Bolsheviks. Sectarian religious groups were appearing everywhere, and they were impossible to keep track of. By the end of the 20s, there were almost 1 million registered members of sectarian churches, triple the pre-war numbers. Worse still was the fact that many of them were developing networks of clubs, recreation circles, cooperatives, and mutual aid societies in order to further their cause. This not only clashed with the stated goals of socialist reconstruction as a secular project, but it came into direct conflict with the Komsomol and other groups whose purpose, among other things, was to reach out to the peasants and teach them the value of socialism. It was under these pressures that the religious organizing law was signed. While religious beliefs themselves were never persecuted, given the open, well-funded resistance to Soviet power which these institutions posed, the law enshrined religious institutions as a phenomenon which necessarily had to exist, but would only be allowed to do so outside of the Soviet system. Among other things, the law took voting rights away from people who were part of a religious group, defined as 20 people or more who have registered as a religious institution. Restricted religious activities and speeches of priests, preachers, and instructors to the residence of members of their religious organization, as well as the religious buildings associated specifically with their group. Restricted them from levying forced contributions. Restricted them from making contracts of any sort. Banned all teaching of religious faith within schools or educational establishments. Restricted them from organizing religious or other meetings intended for children, young people, or women, specifically naming biblical, handicraft, excursions, children's playgroups, libraries, and sanatoria. They banned them from providing medical aid. They were not allowed to use more than one building. They were not allowed to list anyone as a member of the group who had not given their expressed consent. Only books necessary for the function of services were permitted in the buildings used for religious purposes. They could not use any emblem or slogan established for organs or institutions of Soviet power. Any ritual objects, buildings, whether gifts or not, were considered nationalized property. One of the unintended outcomes of this law was that all Soviets with churches in their areas needed to vote whether to keep them as religious buildings or whether to appropriate them, since they were now considered nationalized property. As one might imagine, this didn't go over well in some areas. A security report from the time, written by Deputy Lieutenant Colonel Davidov, shed some light on the difficulties which resulted from this.
On May 1st of this year, at a meeting in the village of Olshanitsa, the question was raised at the initiative of the chairman of the village Soviet of closing the local church and handing it over for the cultural needs of a primary school. There were no objections to closing the church on the part of the citizens present at the meeting, nor were there any objections on the part of believers or at the juridical registration of its closure. As a result, the Municipal Executive Committee passed a resolution to close the church within a 2-week period to allow for complaints to the local Soviet. The result was that in the 2-week period, no complaints came in, and on August 7th of this year, the head of the district admin department traveled to the church. On arrival, it was presumed that the church warden would give them the keys to the church. The warden refused to turn over the keys, however, and the priest of the church, by then called, appeared in a drunken state, accompanied by a group of women who were beside themselves. During the heated dispute that ensued, 2 of the people that had arrived with the priest, the woman Kolganova and an old man, Drozdov, climbed up the bell tower and sounded the alarm. As a result, people ran in from the fields with sickles and stakes, up to 350 women who drove away the representatives who had come to the church. Having investigated the women's mass resistance, it has become clear: no preparatory work on the part of the local party and social organizations was conducted among the people to create an appropriate opinion on closing the church. Even the party cells themselves did not examine or even discuss the question at their party meetings and gatherings, and confined themselves just to the decisions of the village Soviet plenum and the raising of the question in May.
The fervor which gripped the masses, ecstatic to construct a brand new society, as is obvious from this example, sometimes resulted in excesses or short-sightedness. The cities were not immune to this either. Opposite the shrine of the Iberian Virgin in Red Square, was a plaque reading, "Religion is the opium for the people." In 1931, the shrine and the Resurrection Gate, which housed it, built in the 17th century, were destroyed altogether to allow large vehicles the ability to drive through. Many believers simply rolled their eyes and carried on as they always had. When American journalist William Henry Chamberlain spent time in the USSR in the late 20s and early 30s, he wrote of a family whom he visited.
In one corner of the room, the wife continues to burn candles before the traditional Russian icons, or carved images representing Jesus, the Virgin Mary, and scenes from the Bible and lives of the saints. In another place, the communist husband has arranged his linen corner.
Adding fuel to the fire, the Central Committee passed the Declaration of the 5-Day Workweek, which ostensibly was designed to optimize industrial production among other businesses by keeping workplaces open 7 days a week, with people having 2 designated days off. In practice, the edict infuriated religious-minded folk by requiring some people to work on the Sabbath. A 55-year-old Muscovite, Ivan Shitz, wrote in his diary on the 8th of January 1930,
The Bolsheviks managed to ruin Christmas completely, destroying churches, occupying them for potato fields, turning them into clubs, removing bells. Children were invited to indicate in questionnaires whether they go to church and, if they do, voluntarily or under duress from their parents. All these methods ended with the introduction of uninterrupted work and 5-day work, which destroyed the very concept of a holiday and destroyed the possibility of communication between people. Oh, and by the way, since almost all trade was forcibly concentrated in Soviet cooperatives, they arranged it so that by the holidays, the shops were empty. It was impossible to get any gingerbread, sweets, snacks, or wine.
By 1931, General Secretary of the CPSU Joseph Stalin, noting that it was too sudden and too ambitious, used his considerable influence to amend the 5-day workweek, allowing for the traditional holy day to be observed without work. Further along in his diary, Schitz makes an interesting observation, particularly given the prevailing mood among other Soviet citizens at the time, that the sectarians were not to be sneezed at. He wrote,
People who come from the villages say that the peasants are quite indifferent to religious oppression, with the exception of the sectarians, and even willingly join the collective farms, saying, maybe it will be better this way. I'll sell everything and join the collective. There's 8 hours of work. They'll give you bread.
The reality was that the church and religious groups fought vociferously against the Soviet workers' government, particularly among the peasant-heavy populations. The priests were fond of spreading silly and salacious rumors, in turn. They would tell the peasants that all the collective farmers and their families would have to sleep under one gigantic blanket. Further, they would claim that the peasants' wives would be collectivized along with the land. Indeed, Peter Bogdanov wrote of an encounter while traveling through Novgorod to visit the surrounding peasant villages.
The devil knows what is going on in this world. Alexander Mantsarev, son of the late Prince Mantsarev, came to me. He said that he was the leader of a new socialist party. I asked what kind of party. It turns out that there is no party, but there is the, quote, Society of Northern Truth. The future structure of human society is sexualistic, end quote. He said that the state will regulate sexual life because all qualities come from it. Collective marriage, forced cohabitation of individuals according to a schedule, state brothels, state breeding centers for people, incubators for hatching humans like chickens. What the hell? I looked closely to see if he was crazy, but it didn't look like he was.
The American journalist we met in Part 1, Anna Louise Strong, recounted eavesdropping on a conversation in a small village. Some peasant women had heard that not only plows and horses, but even babies would be nationalized. A young man nearby began laughing.
Are babies means of production? Who wants your kids? The woman defended herself against this. I cannot read.
How can I know if the priest speaks truth? My father was a literate man, so also will my children be. But we? How should we not believe these rumors?
Another woman said,
2 months ago, I could not tell letters from figures, but now I've learned them. We can learn more.
collectivization, industrialization, and dekulakization. Knowledge of the context of pre-collectivization agriculture in the USSR is hazy for most of us in the West. Not because the contextual info doesn't exist, but because it is important for liberal ideologues and non-academic historians to disconnect the persecution of the kulaks from any justification for that persecution. Industrialization had created proletarian jobs in the cities, which provided a better standard of living, and so, millions of poor peasants flooded into metropolitan areas, but not before selling their land to their kulak neighbors. But this industrialization and the attendant mass exodus created additional issues. Demand for grain and agricultural products increased, even while its producers vanished from the farmland. But, in terms of how to address the deficit of foodstuffs, mechanization and modernization were key to increasing the yields of Soviet land, and collectivization was key to rapid mechanization and modernization. The kulaks, for their part, were content to keep things as they were, because their land holdings were sufficient to make a decent living by employing other peasants to sow, tend, and reap. Moreover, kulaks were buying up the harvests of their poorer neighbors, and when they had a monopoly on grain in a particular area, they would demand higher prices from the state, forcing the Soviet Union to redirect funds from other sources, as the state was truly desperate for anything it could get. The initial violence perpetrated by the kulaks was not because their land was being collectivized. In 1928 and 1929, the onset of the liquidation of kulak landholdings was still many months away. Yet the kulaks beat, killed, and conspired to kill local commissars. They burned the buildings and crops of collective farms because the poor peasants were collectivizing voluntarily and being given modern equipment and access to tractors and mechanized harvesters, as well as being allowed to utilize state-run mills and creameries. These innovations made the collective farms more efficient, increased their yield, and allowed the poor peasants to divest from using kulak-owned processing facilities and equipment. It also meant that the kulaks could no longer conscript those peasants to work their land, nor could the kulaks buy up the products of poor peasants. That's what drove their animosity toward the state at the outset, a cutting of their profits, a limit on their exploitation. One of the 5 churches in Atkarsk had been converted into a jail to hold kulaks for trial, as the old jail was insufficient in size. This was, again, prior to the liquidation process, which began in early 1930. There were, on the one hand, poor peasants who were enthusiastic about collectivization. On the other, the kulaks. But somewhere in between were peasants who had sufficient land to make a living on their own, but not enough to employ others to work that land. These peasants were at a crossroads. Did they try to become kulaks themselves, grind the poor down and exploit them for wealth? Or did they give up their autonomy and join their fellow peasants in collectivizing? While there was some wavering initially, once the success of mechanization and modernization could be seen in collective farms, the bulk of middle peasants fell in with the poor ones, at least for a while. Collectivization was handled initially somewhat haphazardly. The folks on the ground guiding the process were a collection of individuals well educated in developing projects, but with no farming knowledge, mixed in with those who knew agriculture well, but did not understand how to implement such a large-scale restructuring. They did their best, but with no prior examples to draw upon, debates raged over how large was too large for a collective farm, how many horses can be supported per acre of grazing land, and so on. In Moscow, at the Kremlin, when the new decade turned, 52-year-old Joseph Stalin sat, energetically writing a response to his favorite non-communist, Maxim Gorky, about the necessity for self-criticism. It was cold. January 1930 would turn out to have all of the coldest days of the year. A few days later, he was writing a different sort of letter, a response to an article in Krasnaya Zvezda, a political newspaper and later the official paper of the Red Army, entitled "The Elimination of Kulaks as a Class." The original author of the piece attempts to explain the reasoning behind the January 6th Central Committee resolution calling for it. Stalin, in his meticulous way, worries constantly that there will be misunderstanding as to the purpose of these measures. He is dedicated to bringing understanding of the project of the CPSU to every single citizen who will listen. The journalist mentions in the article that,
in the Restoration period, we conducted a policy of restricting the capitalist elements of town and country. With the inauguration of the Reconstruction period, we passed from the policy of restricting to the policy of ousting them.
this, Stalin said, was an incorrect framing. The ousting was an inevitable result of restricting. He wrote,
The author of the above-mentioned article forgets that the kulaks, as a class, cannot be ousted by taxation measures or any other restrictions, as long as they are allowed to retain instruments of production and the right to free use of land, and as long as we ourselves preserve in the countryside the ability to hire labor, the ability to rent land, and the previous ban on dekulakization. The act of restricting and ousting the capitalist elements in the countryside, its point of departure was that, despite measures restricting kulaks, they, as a class, nevertheless, were bound to remain for the time being. On those grounds, the 15th Congress in 1927 left alone the ability to rent land, although it knew very well that it was mostly kulaks who rented land. They left in force the ability to hire labor in the countryside. On those grounds, it was again proclaimed that dekulakization was impermissible. Do these laws and decisions contradict the policy of restricting and ousting the capitalist elements in the countryside? Certainly not. Do these laws and decisions contradict the policy of eliminating the kulaks as a class? Certainly they do. Consequently, these laws and decisions must now be set aside in the areas of complete collectivization, which is spreading by leaps and bounds. Incidentally, they have already been set aside by the very progress of the collective farm movement in the areas of complete collectivization.
Before we move on, a distinction needs to be made, particularly for those most familiar with capitalist politics. While in the West, particularly the United States, we view the center or centrists as those who straddle the line between left and right wings, not committed to anything in particular, save the survival of the status quo. Within the Soviet structure of government, which is arguably guided by scientific theory, Marxism, Leninism, dialectical and historical materialism, the center are the majority party who generally agree on the path which those theories are interpreted to dictate. The left, or left deviation as they are more commonly called, are those who believe in a weakening of the central state and strengthening of more horizontal forms of governance. The right, or right deviation, are those who believe in a restoration or embracing of more capitalist elements in order to slow the pace of socialist transformation and kick the can down the road, so to speak. Now, when the looming agricultural crisis began to reveal itself in 1925, some members of the party believed in staying the course of Lenin's new economic policy, which we covered in part 1 of this series. The right, led by Bukharin, Rykov, and Tomsky, felt that the Soviets should commit even harder to the NEP, giving greater concessions to the middle-class peasants. Bukharin even quoted 1840s French politician Guizot calling on these individuals to enrich yourself. He also believed and admitted that their plan would mean socialism would evolve at the speed of a notoriously slow peasant pony. By the late 1920s, though, the majority, the center, of the CPSU, knew that allowing the wealthy landowning peasants, the kulaks, to continue as they had would pose an incredible threat to the building of socialism. In 1927, the kulaks produced 21.7 billion pounds of grain, of which only 4.7 billion was purchasable by the government for the purposes of feeding the population, while collective and state farms produced a relatively meager 2.9 billion pounds of grain, with only 1.3 billion for sale. This was after years of subsidy to collective farms. Essentially, given their massive land holdings, the capitalist-minded kulaks had a chokehold on the progress of socialist construction. At any point, they could refuse sale, restrict sale, or, as they were doing at the time, inflate prices, making it unaffordable for the state to purchase. However, with only 2.9 billion pounds of grain available from the kolkhoz, a complete liquidation of the capitalist elements in the rural areas would have meant starvation for the villages. But make no mistake, a vast majority of poor peasants were tired of being starved and taken advantage of by the kulaks. They were waiting for the liberation they'd been promised, that the industrial areas had received with the ending of the NEP. As you may know, most socialists are proponents of dialectical materialism, and this particular contradiction could not be allowed to continue if socialism was to survive in a world which was unendingly hostile to it. By 1927 and 1928, the grain available to purchase was still only 37% of the pre-war level. Agricultural prices were falling too quickly, while the costs of frenetic industrialization remained high. This meant that the peasantry, particularly the wealthy ones who could afford to hold out, had no desire or motivation to market more grain. They called it the scissor crisis. Something had to be done. The restrictions placed on kulaks after the 15th Party Congress essentially taxed them at very high rates in order to either force them to make up for the grain which they weren't selling, or were selling at inflated prices, or put them into a position in which it would make more sense for them to join the collectivization movement. This, of course, did not happen. Instead, they began a campaign of openly hostile antagonism toward the Soviet government, the kolkhoz, and even the middle-class peasants. But what should be done? Engels wrote of the large landowning peasants in The Peasant Question in France and Germany,
Most likely, we shall be able to abstain here as well from resorting to forcible expropriation and, as for the rest, to count on future economic developments making these stubborn elements amenable to reason. It would be unnecessary to expropriate them if they can realize the inevitability of the doom of their present mode of production and draw the necessary conclusions.
The Bolsheviks prided themselves on not being dogmatic, though, and none more than Stalin. Engels' thesis was that the question of the elimination of the kulaks was related to their attitude toward the new mode of production. In this case, the proletarian state and its collective farms. The logical conclusion was that, with the current antagonism and restrictions placed on the kulaks, their attitude had not yet shifted to the inevitability of their doom. The stronger Soviet power grew, and the more quickly socialism took root, and the weaker the kulaks became, the fiercer their opposition. With the crisis of food shortage looming for the cities, industrial workers, and military, something had to give. To provide further context to the pre-liquidation violence, in 1928, kulaks committed 1,027 acts of terrorism, destroying buildings, wrecking tractors, burning barns and silos, slaughtering cattle, and ruining crop harvests. They committed 140 murders that same year. In 1929, they continued terrorist acts and began to organize into armed revolts against the local Soviets in a number of districts and republics. The rest of the peasantry did not rest on its laurels, though, and neither did the local and central governments. They ratcheted up the collectivization program, and conditions quickly shifted to be increasingly favorable to the poor peasants and the kolkhoz. 1929 saw collective and state farms produce 14.4 million pounds of grain, with 4.7 million going to market, almost quadruple what they had done just 1 year prior. 1 million households joined the kolkhoz. In the last quarter of 1929, twice as many peasant households joined the collective farms as in the entirety of 1917 to 1928 combined. In the winter of 1929, Anna Louise Strong was teaching English to a Ukrainian economist, Perchik, who was, in turn, answering her questions on the general trajectory of the USSR, as well as specific conditions in various places. Rumors were pouring into Moscow from the western USSR regarding rampant vigilante attacks on kulaks. Strong expressed her concern over lynch law and wondered aloud whether kulaks had any rights. Perchik responded that it was perhaps not the violence which concerned Strong, but the anarchy of it all, and Strong agreed.
There really is too much anarchy, he added, for which we communists are to blame. It comes from division within the party. Stalin has stated the party policy, abolition of kulaks as a class. But the right-wing elements in the party and in parts of the government apparatus sabotage its execution, thus delaying its exact formulation into law. Having no guidance in law, the left-wing elements among our local comrades do what is right in their own eyes and in the eyes of the farmhands, which is anarchy. We expect government decrees soon. Then there will be more order.
Strong reflected upon these words and wrote,
I saw for the first time why communists insist on rigid unity within the party, without fractions. Disunity at the top means chaos in the country.
This was, for better or for worse, a movement powered by the people themselves. Individual households in complete collectivization areas, of which there were many, particularly in the Middle Volga and the steppe lands of Ukraine, among others, were forbidden by the local movement to hire farmhands. Land leases were abolished. They expropriated kulak properties as well as the equipment and turned them over to the kolkhoz. 1930 introduced machine tractor stations to the kolkhoz, revolutionizing the practice of farming. And it worked. Lenin once said,
If by tomorrow we could produce 100,000 first-class tractors and provide them with fuel, then the average peasant would say, yes, I am for communism.
And damn if he wasn't right. By the end of 1931, the number of kolkhoz was 211,000, with 63% of sown land. While their number of draft animals was only 17% of the country's total in 1930, that number skyrocketed to 50% in 1931. It wasn't all puppies and sunshine, though. Particularly in 1930, when the campaign increased at a frenzied pace, and 1932 when drought and kulak resistance reached their peak. In many ways, the first months of 1930 can, and probably should, be viewed as an opening of a relief valve whose pressure had been building for years. Immediately it took off. Anna Louise Strong spent much of this period touring the USSR. She wrote in 1934, looking back at her notes and interviews,
The usual assumption outside the Soviet Union is that exiling of the kulaks was led by a mystically omnipotent GPU. The actual process was quite different. It was done by village meetings of poor peasants and farmhands who listed those kulaks who impeded the collective farm by force and violence, and asked the government to deport them. I attended many of these meetings. There were harsh, bitter discussions, analyzing one by one the families who had grabbed the best lands, exploited labor by owning the tools of production, and only renting them out as the wealthier families normally and historically do, and who were now fighting the rise of collective farms by arson, cattle killing, and murder. The meetings I personally attended were more seriously judicial, more balanced in their discussion than any court trial I have attended in America. These peasants knew they were dealing with serious punishments and did not handle them lightly. Those who envisaged the rural revolution as a war between Stalin and the peasants simply weren't on the ground when the whirlwind broke.
From her diary entries when she was on the ground in the west of Russia in 1930, she says,
In Balanda, where the class division was sharp between a few kulak families which had formerly possessed several hundred acres and the poor peasants who had worked on the landlord's estates, mass meetings were being held to, quote-unquote, clean out such kulaks as had entered the collective farms. There was even talk of cleaning them out of the village. Quote, What use have we for exploiters anymore? They spread rumors. They burn our barns and haystacks. End quote. When I left the farms, I asked an organizer in Saratov, what does Moscow say about this, about that? He answered hurriedly, but proudly, quote, We cannot wait to hear from Moscow. Moscow makes its plans from what we do, end quote. But back in Moscow, the foreign correspondents called it the orders from Moscow and Stalin's war against the peasants.
and her experience seems to be the reality. Less than 3 months after the Central Committee approved the liquidation of the kulaks as a class, Stalin wrote an article in Pravda dated March 2nd titled, Concerning Questions of the Collective Farm Movement. After summarizing the already substantial gains of the campaign, he spoke of these successes in a materialist and sober manner, mentioning that there was no need to prove that the successes were important. The working class and the party were well aware and feeling confident and cheerful.
But the successes have their seamy side, especially when they are attained with supposed ease, unexpectedly, so to speak. Such successes sometimes induce a spirit of vanity and conceit. We might say, we can achieve anything. There's nothing we can't do. People not infrequently become dizzy with success, lose all sense of proportion and the capacity to understand realities. Adventurous attempts are made to solve all questions of socialist construction in a hurry. In such a case, there is no room for concern to consolidate the successes achieved and to utilize them systematically for further advancement. The party's task is to wage a determined struggle against these sentiments, which are dangerous and harmful to our cause, and to drive them out of the party. The successes of our collective farm policy are due, among other things, to the fact that it rests on the voluntary character of the collective farm movement and on taking into account the diversity of conditions in the various regions of the USSR. Collective farms must not be established by force. That would be foolish and reactionary. The collective farm movement must rest on the active support of the main mass of the peasantry. Examples of the formation of collective farms in the developed areas must not be mechanically transplanted to underdeveloped areas. That would also be foolish and reactionary. Such a policy would discredit the collectivization idea at one stroke.
When Stalin's words were published in a pamphlet entitled Dizzy with Success, they had unintended consequences. Peasants rushed out to purchase it and wave it in the faces of overenthusiastic local officials. Stalin was arguing for the artel model of collectivization versus the commune or kolkhoz, as he felt it would be more appealing to individualist peasants. Under the artel, One could still possess their own home, their own garden, their own cows, their own chickens. But many left-leaning locals had been, more or less, forcing collectivization on peasants and collectivizing their chickens. Dizzy with success had made Stalin a hero to the peasants, but in response, Stalin published a follow-up pamphlet entitled Answers to Collective Peasants. Therein, he attempted to squash this hero worship. He addressed his fans directly, saying,
Some people speak as if Stalin alone made this statement of policy. The Central Committee does not exist to permit such action by any individual. The statement was a reconnaissance undertaken by the CC.
Stalin's words were merely a relaying of the decisions of the Central Committee. It was a collective statement, backed with collective policy. A month and a half later, we have archival documents from the commander of the Siberian Military District regarding directives sent from the military leaders forbidding the use of military in operations against the kulaks. The term used is categorically forbidden. By February 1931, some sense of order was being established, at least temporarily. Deportation of kulaks could only happen in regions in which serious collectivization efforts had been completed, and even then, only when mass meetings resulted in a majority vote for expulsion from the community, which then had to be ratified by local authorities. This stopped the widespread, indiscriminate persecution, but did not stop individual instances of mob violence or official overreach by local commissars. But Anna Louise Strong felt that more could be done, that Stalin could step in and repress these excesses. She said as much to her student and comrade. But again, Perchik defended the party, arguing that attacking local officials and comrades could be a dangerous prospect, given the tenuous progress being made. That, until the grain was safe in collectivized storehouses, famine was still a risk. Sabotage and theft were still a risk. Sadly, regardless of such restraint, 1931 and 1932 brought drought to many regions of the USSR, and this created the perfect opportunity in the summer of 1932 for the kulaks to launch a counteroffensive. The party's internal security apparatus recorded armed assaults on collective farmers working in fields, arson, sabotage of agricultural machines, battery, threats and reprisals against collective farmers and the local representatives of the government. Poor and middle-class peasants who chose not to join the collective farm movement, faced with severe shortages and, in some cases, starvation, also caused problems. In some districts, the theft of up to 5 hectares of grain crops was reported. On a train from Moscow to Stalingrad, formerly Tsaritsyn, Strong encountered news of chaos in the west of the Union. Priests stirring up dissent, kulaks burning collective farms and slaughtering livestock, local officials turning to brigandry or needlessly stoking anger among the peasantry. Strong relayed this info to Perchik, who replied,
You don't know the half of it. We are like a man on skis on a swift slope. Our acceleration is terrific and grows even greater. We cannot stop, nor control the speed nor distance. We can only guide our jumps and endeavor to land properly. We must succeed, for if we do not, then everything is finished.
But the end of 1932 saw the end of the major struggles with agriculture and, outside of the unavoidable circumstances resulting from the Nazi invasion less than a decade later, the cyclical droughts with which the region had dealt for its entire existence would never again result in starvation or food insecurity. And, perhaps even more importantly, without the resources available from a majority collective farm system, the Red Army would never have survived the Great Patriotic War.
The show trials. Let us backtrack for a moment. In 1918, when Soviet Foreign Commissar Leon Trotsky, was sent by Lenin to Brest-Litovsk. He was under explicit instructions to sign a peace. Lenin was desperate for time to breathe, to consolidate the fledgling proletarian power. Trotsky was a firm believer in the ultra-left position of world revolution. He did not want to negotiate with imperialist, capitalist powers. He declared at the conference that the Soviet government would in no way make peace with the capitalists. "Neither peace nor war," he shouted. He told the Germans that the Red Army could neither fight any longer, nor would they stop. Trotsky's diplomatic blunders would end up costing the Soviets parts of Ukraine, Finland, Poland, the Caucasus, and many lives. At the same time at which Trotsky arrived in town, Bruce Lockhart, a young special agent of the British War Cabinet, arrived as well. He had been sent to establish some sort of working relationship, short of official recognition, with the upstart Soviet state. Lockhart and the British government saw Trotsky as their best chance at forming a government with which they could work. After watching and then developing a personal relationship with Trotsky, with whom he was familiar enough to address him in his friendly manner of Lev Davidovich, Lockhart reported much to the British government regarding the situation.
Trotsky strikes me as a man who would willingly die fighting for Russia, provided there were a big enough audience to see him do it. He is a great organizer and a man of immense physical courage, but morally, he is incapable of standing against Lenin as a flea would be against an elephant.
Lockhart thought that Trotsky was trying to form what he called a holy war bloc within the Bolshevik Party, designed to secure backing from the Allies and force Lenin from power. He wrote that he dreamed of pulling off a coup with Trotsky at the head. This, of course, did not happen. The statement stands only to demonstrate that from the moment the Bolshevik Revolution took form, not only were major foreign governments working to infiltrate and undermine it, they had already set their sights on precisely who might help them accomplish this. The focus on Trotsky as a possible ally did not change as the decades wore on. When he was exiled from the USSR, Trotsky ended up on the island of Prinkipo, Turkey, living in a 9,000 square foot beachside home with a private pier. He lived there from 1929 to 1933. Of the former Bolsheviks' time there, Winston Churchill wrote,
Trotsky strives to rally the underworld of Europe to the overthrow of the Russian army.
American foreign correspondent John Gunther visited Prinkipo. He was surprised by the fact that Trotsky behaved more like a ruling monarch than a defeated exile. Gunther reported in Harper's Magazine,
Trotsky movement has grown up throughout most of Europe. In each country, there is a nucleus of Trotskyite agitators. They take orders from Prinkipo direct. There is a sort of communication between various groups through their publications and manifestos, but mostly through private letters. The various central committees are linked to an international headquarters in Berlin.
In 1930, when Trotsky published his autobiography, the ascendant Hitler, according to his biographer, stunned a group of his friends by bursting into praise of the manuscript, calling it brilliant. He told them that he had learned much from it, and that they could also. The Japanese secret police made it mandatory reading for imprisoned Japanese and Chinese communists. Trotsky was launching a frenzy of anti-Soviet writings from the Prince's Island of Prinkipo, while the world outside of the USSR was dealing with the absolute catastrophe of the stock market crash at the end of 1929. Industrial Party Trial. An organized group of incredibly wealthy Russian immigrants known as Torgprom, Russian Trade, Financial, and Industrial Committee, met with two Soviet Russians in the late 1920s in Paris, director of the Moscow Thermotechnical Institute, Professor Leonid Razmin, and chairman of the fuel section of the State Planning Commission of the USSR, Viktor Lerachev. Lerachev and Razmin represented a group of primarily previously privileged technical intelligentsia who had served under the Tsar and now worked for the Soviet government. The group called themselves the Industrial Party, and supposedly had close to 2,000 members, funded and directed by Torgprom. They were carrying out spying and sabotage operations within Soviet industry. Their methods were twofold, they reported to Torgprom. First, to weaken standards of quality for industrial goods, creating hostility between the various representatives of the national economy. And second, the so-called freezing of capital, or investing Soviet money in absolutely unnecessary construction. Professor Razman told his Torgprom handlers,
Without a doubt, it has lowered the general level of the economic life of the country, thus creating discontent among large masses of the population.
In 1928, they complained about the recent arrest of some workers in the Shakti mines who had been under their employ, as well as the relative peace among the central committees since the exile of Trotsky, both of which were making their task harder. They needed more support from Torgprom, but more importantly, they could not continue on forever. They needed foreign intervention. S.V. Denisov, former Cossack White Army general and member of Torgprom leadership, had good news. The French General Staff had formed a special commission to determine the feasibility of invading the USSR and to develop a plan for such an action. Later, at a meeting between Razman and the French colonel Joinville, it was suggested that Razman form a self-contained military branch of the Industrial Party and gave him the name of French agents in Moscow with whom he could coordinate. From Paris, Professor Razman flew to London, ostensibly on Soviet business, where he met representatives of the oil conglomerate Royal Dutch Shell and of the munitions trust Metro Vickers, who had once controlled large interests in pre-revolutionary Russia. Royal Dutch Shell was the firm of Sir Henry Dietering. A few years earlier, he had been implicated in the Berlin Schervenetz trial, in which he and others funded the printing of millions of counterfeit Soviet banknotes, which were then smuggled into the USSR to balloon inflation. The aforementioned British interests would provide financial support to the Industrial Party and increase pressure on the British government to ensure the isolation of the Soviets. French agents in Moscow were the intermediaries once the leaders were back in the Soviet Union. They delivered for sabotage activities 500,000 rubles to the metal industry, 300,000 rubles to fuel and oil, 200,000 rubles to the textile industry, and 100,000 rubles to the electrical industry. By summer 1930, one of the Torgprom leaders, Vladimir Ryabushinsky, in his excitement for the upcoming invasion, wrote an article in the Parisian white émigré paper Vozrojdeny, an article entitled A Necessary War. In it, he claimed,
The coming struggle against the Third International to secure the liberation of Russia will, beyond a doubt, be assigned by history to the group of most just and serviceable of all wars. Up to 1925, specialists were prepared to carry out this operation with an army of 1 million, estimated to cost 100 million British pounds. But now, probably 500,000 men, and 3 to 4 months would be sufficient to finish off this work, as a result of the international political and economic difficulties. We can safely make the assertion that there is not an enterprise in the world which would be more justified from a business standpoint than that of effecting the emancipation of Russia. By spending 1 billion rubles, mankind would receive a return of not less than 5 billion rubles. A 500% increase annually with the prospect of a further increase of profit every year by another 100 or 200%? Where could you do better business?
What Ryabushinsky didn't realize was that the Great Depression would completely sap France and Britain's desire to invest in another war in Russia. He also failed to realize that the world crisis, through its isolation of the USSR, had saved it. Though struggling with the collectivization and large-scale sabotage addressed earlier, it was, on the whole, improving the lives of a majority of its citizens at a rapid pace, especially via the rise of internally developed heavy industry. Additionally, the 1928 Shakti trial had opened the eyes of the optimistic Central Committee, and by the fall of 1930, the OGPU, or Joint State Political Directorate, had uncovered the Torgprom-led plot. The leaders of the Industrial Party were members of the Social Revolutionary and Menshevik parties, along with White Guards active in the country. But a number of Polish, French, and Romanian Secret Service agents were also rounded up, with many put on trial before the Soviet Supreme Court between November 25 and December 7. Presented with evidence from Soviet intelligence, the 8 primary defendants, one by one, admitted their guilt. 5, including Professor Razman, were sentenced to death. The others to 10 years imprisonment, the maximum prison sentence in the Soviet Union. 2 days after the trial was concluded, those who were due to receive the death penalty petitioned the Soviet government for mercy. The court granted their appeal, and all sentences were commuted to 10 years. Union Bureau Trial. The Industrial Party trial began a slow but accelerating pulling of threads. In March of 1931, the Soviet authorities rounded up 14 former Mensheviks who were charged with leading a sabotage ring, which they called the Union Bureau. They were also put on trial before the Soviet Supreme Court. One of the conspirators, Groman, was a high-placed State Planning Committee member. The main thrust of this group's purpose was to sabotage the first 5-year plan by drawing up incorrect estimates, lowering production goals in vital industries, and other wrecking activities. Our good friends at Torgprom funded this group as well, who further liaised with former Menshevik leader Raphael Abramovich, who had fled to Germany after the revolution. 8 days after the trial, the defendants were sentenced to between 5 and 10 years in prison. Abramovich, writing from Germany, issued a statement denying that he went to Russia, as had been stated in various confessions throughout the trial. He did, however, admit that there had been an illegally active organization of Mensheviks in Russia, and that they were in communication by a letter with a delegation in Berlin. What should be remembered regarding both this trial and the Industrial Party trial is that several of the defendants from the Union Bureau conspiracy, along with Professor Razman, went on to hold important roles in the USSR. Following their sentences, they were considered rehabilitated. Tarl, Lurk, Vinogradov, and Talanov, in particular, headed some of the most important scientific institutions in the USSR. Metro Vickers trial. The last major trial in the early 1930s was the most sensational. Late at night on March 11, 1933, the OGPU executed a coup de grace against the third and final Torgprom conspiracy still alive in the Soviet Union. In a move which made headlines around the world, they arrested 10 Soviet citizens and 6 British engineers of the Moscow branch of Razman's old benefactor, Metro Vickers. They were charged with having carried out espionage and sabotage on behalf of the British Secret Service. The chief representative, Captain C.S. Richards, fled back to Britain shortly before the arrests began. Richards had been a British intelligence agent in Russia since 1917, where he led the preparations for the Allied occupation of Archangel, which became a bastion of White Army support from 1918 to 1920. Following the war, Richards settled in as a director of the Moscow office of Metro Vickers, a position he exploited as the center of British Secret Service operations within Russia. One of his compatriots from the Archangel days, Alan Monkhouse, who served as second-in-command in the Moscow office, was not as fortunate as his boss. Monkhouse pled not guilty to the charges, while admitting that he and Richards had worked together in Archangel in the early years of the war. Leslie Thornton, son of a wealthy Tsarist textile manufacturer, who had been sent to Moscow as Vickers' chief erecting engineer, wrote and signed his deposition 2 days after arrest. In it, he stated that they had indeed been spying for the British intelligence service, under Richards and Monkhouse. Thornton also admitted to being a director, as well as the person responsible for gradually bringing British personnel into the spying organization. In rapid succession, the Brits began to squeal on each other. Thornton gave up Monkhouse's assistant Kushney, who gave up Nordwall, and so on. The British press was whipped into a frenzy. The Observer described the trial as
an ordeal conducted in the name of justice, but bearing no resemblance to any judicial proceedings that civilization knows.
The Daily Express said,
Soviet prosecutor Vyshinsky, the carrot-haired, red-faced Russian, spat insults and pounded the table.
The Evening Standard described the defense thus,
Counselor Broad is the sort of Jew one might meet any evening in Shaftesbury Avenue.
The Daily Mail, which would become the quasi-official voice of Sir Oswald Mosley's British Fascist Party, spun stories of a supposed Tibetan drug, which had been used by the OGPU to destroy the willpower of its victims in order to extract false confessions. The British government slapped an embargo on Russian imports. But each of the defendants described in detail the activities they had committed, down to the boiler numbers on some of the individual items sabotaged. All of the British defendants went on to declare that they had not been coerced or tortured in any way. Monkhouse, who never admitted guilt to the charges, nonetheless told the London Dispatch,
"The OGPU examiners were extraordinarily nice to me, and exceedingly reasonable in their questioning. My examiners seemed first-rate men who knew their job. The OGPU prison is the last word in efficiency, entirely clean, orderly, and well-organized. This is the first time that I have been arrested, but I have visited English prisons and can attest that the OGPU quarters are much superior. They showed every concern for my comfort."
In the end, the leniency of the sentences shocked the foreign press. On April 18, 1933, the Supreme Court handed down the verdict. All but one of the Russians were found guilty and given sentences of 3 to 10 years. The British Albert Gregory was acquitted on lack of evidence. The other 5 were found guilty. Monkhouse, Nordwall, and Cushney were deported, and Thornton and MacDonald were given 2 to 3 years in prison. Later, the British government reopened trade in exchange for Thornton and MacDonald, who were sent back to England. And while Torgprom's influence had finally been smashed, substantial economic costs had been inflicted, and fodder for the foreign press and local dissidents had been firmly entrenched. Still, the boulder of Soviet progress rolled ever on.
The 5-year plans. While we covered some of the first 5-year plan in Part 1, much more comprised the project than we addressed. Stalin said at the 17th Party Congress in January 1934,
"We have laid the foundations of the Ural-Kuznets combine, uniting the Kuznets coal with the Ural iron ore. The new Ural economic base has thus become, from being a dream, a reality. And the foundations of a new and powerful oil industry have been laid on the western and southern slopes of the Ural Mountains, in the region of Uralsk, in Bashkiria, and at Kazakhstan."
light industry, while less of a priority than the heavy variety, was a part of the first 5-year plan. Between 1928 and 1932, production grew by 187%. Retail and grocery shops increased in numbers. Restaurants fed 20 million people a day in 1932. But in financial terms, the predicted cost of the first 5-year plan was approximately 86 billion rubles, but the actual cost was 116 billion rubles, an overage of nearly 34%. From where did the additional capital arrive? According to People's Commissar for Financial Affairs, Rory Hrinko,
The principal reason that has enabled us to accumulate so much capital lies in the primary fact that waste of national revenue, such as takes place in capitalist countries, does not exist with us. We have got rid of the parasitic classes which in all capitalist countries consume an enormous portion of the national revenues without producing anything. We do not go in for imperialist politics. There is not anarchy in our social production. All our resources are applied, almost exclusively, to the building up of our economic and cultural systems.
Further, Stalin wrote,
Substantially, in capitalist countries, the funds invested in big industrial schemes are obtained either by foreign loans or by spoliation.
By this he means war indemnities, colonial confiscations, and the exploitation of labor. Continuing in the words of French political activist and author Henri Barbusse,
The USSR does not employ these methods. It is unable to borrow, and it leaves the employment of spoliation methods to quote-unquote civilized countries, so that it has to find the capital to invest from its own resources.
a monopoly on resources, as well as overages drawn for many state services which ran a surplus, were the two major sources of income for the USSR, as opposed to taxes in the traditional sense. Let us make a comparison among nations at this time to see how successful, or not, the 5-year plan was, as opposed to the tactics used by capitalist nations. By 1933, U.S. economic production was 110.2% of its pre-World War I figures. France, 107.6%. England was only at 85.2% of its pre-World War I capacity, and Germany, 75.4%. The USSR, on the other hand, was at 391% of its prior economic production. Some of this was, indeed, because Russia and the rest of the USSR were quite economically backward as compared to the already industrialized West. But that makes this change all the more impressive. They began with almost nothing and became an industrial powerhouse in under 20 years, and unlike the West, had to suffer through a civil war and the Volga famine following World War I. Indeed, the USSR in 1929 was ranked 5th in the world for overall economic production. By 1933, they were 2nd, behind only the United States. They were 2nd place behind the US in production of general machinery, 3rd behind the US and Canada for electricity production. During the period of the plan, unemployment was almost completely eliminated, from 1.5 million unemployed to practically zero. This was at a time when unemployment was rampant in the West, as the Great Depression was in full swing. It more than doubled in the UK during the same period. Cultural concerns were also a part of the first 5-year plan. 70 languages were represented in the USSR at this time, and fully 20 of those had no previous written component. In order to stabilize the ability to transmit and teach them, an alphabet was developed for each.
The eddies of enthusiastic rhythmic progress are perpetually widening,
proclaimed Stalin. At the intersection of the 5-year plan and collectivization, much of the focus was on giving peasants access to modern machinery. The state provided 2,860 agricultural machinery and tractor stations at the cost of 2 billion rubles. Between 1929 and 1933, 1.6 billion in loans were given to collective farms to construct farm buildings, increase irrigation efficiency, and so on. But at the end of 1934, production had increased so much at these collective farms that the state forgave the remaining 435 million rubles in debt still owed. The old order began to vanish under this peasant-controlled paradigm, or, in the words of Stalin himself,
the old village, dominated by its church, and with the fine houses of the chief of police, the priest, and the kulak in the foreground, and its tumble-down mud huts in the background, is beginning to disappear. In its place, the new village is springing up with its public and economic service buildings, its clubs, its wireless station, its cinema, its schools, its libraries, and its nurseries with its tractors, its reaping machines, its threshing machines, and its motor cars.
Meanwhile, in the US, the agricultural policies which still haunt us today were just being established. Due to overproduction and tumbling prices, the US government began to pay farmers not to grow wheat and corn, began to subsidize cereal crops. Milk was being poured down drains and into rivers just to keep supply down. Entire fields of sugar beets were being buried and seeds burned. Similar processes were taking place in France and Italy with corn and silkworm cocoons, respectively.
If anyone suggested such a procedure here, he would soon find himself in a lunatic asylum,
remarked Stalin. But this is in the imperial core. In colonized nations like India and China, hundreds of millions were eating tree bark and grass. There was overproduction in one part of the capitalist world and starvation in another, with no mechanism by which these two and opposite extremes could be resolved. By contrast, Barbusse points out,
There is no room for such distressing extravagances in the USSR, where all the excess of production in one district is automatically sent where it is lacking.
the workers and the peasantry were not the only forces undergoing significant changes during this time. Clement Voroshilov, Commissar for Defense of the Soviet Union from 1925 to 1940, mentioned to Barbusse that in 1934, he received 152,000 communications from rank-and-file soldiers with suggestions for ways to improve conditions and efficiency in the operation of the Union's military force. Voroshilov commissioned a study to evaluate the most requested and most promising ideas. Transportation is one realm where the USSR was suffering greatly as compared to the West. Soviet officials stated that the cost of raw materials would need to be decreased before it would be feasible, and so this goal, among many others, would be a part of the second five-year plan. It was not until 1934, nearly a decade and a half since the end of the so-called Civil War, that Comrade Molotov, then chairman of the Council of People's Commissars, finally declared reconstruction efforts concluded. And so, it was time for the USSR to begin a new phase, focusing on the development, both quantitatively and qualitatively, of commodity production. Moreover, some of the focus shifted away from industrial development and toward the cultivation of a better quality of life for the workers of the Union. Not that industrialization ceased. The goal of the next five-year plan, 1932 to 1937, was to increase production of the means of production by 209% over the last five-year plan. The agricultural sector would improve by 105%. The number of tractor depots would grow from 2,446 to 6,000, leading to a 60% increase in mechanization. But rather than let mechanization drive income insecurity, as it might in the capitalist world, they increased the number of workers and employees in all branches of the national economy by 26%, with a twofold rise in real wages, a 250% increase in the standards of consumption of meat, fats, fish, eggs, and sugar. On quality of life improvements, electrical capacity would increase 283%, and light industry, producers of foodstuffs and industrial co-ops, would increase consumer commodity production by 269%. There was a 35% drop in retail prices. Transportation, as mentioned before, had been lacking in the USSR until now, and would be addressed by a doubling of railway capacity. Motor transport would increase by a factor of 16 times. Canals would be dug or completed from the White Sea to the Baltic, Moscow to the Volga, and the Volga to the Don River. By the end of 1937, 130,000 miles of new roads would be laid, and air traffic routes would more than double, all accessible to the people. 64 million square meters of new workers' residences would be built, and workers' wages would increase by 2.5 times their 1932 level. Illiteracy would be completely wiped out, primarily by brigades of young people being sent to the far reaches of the periphery of the Union to teach the older peasants and workers who had grown up under the empire. They more than doubled the increase in state expenditures for services such as social insurance, education, and health. They would massively expand the water supply, sewage system, street paving, and landscaping. They would construct houses of Soviets, houses of technique, parks of culture and rest, stadiums, theaters, clubs, movie theaters. They announced the plan for the massive and beautiful Palace of the Soviets, which was, unfortunately, never constructed. The Moscow subway was announced,
with the first line opening in 1935.
The opposition. As with every political entity, there are, in leadership, people who are heavily invested in it. The Soviet Union was no exception. In fact, one could easily say, given the lack of financial motive and the unfathomable amount of time and effort required, that those tied to the project of building socialism in the USSR were dedicated at a level unlikely within other systems. And there were necessarily those who would disagree, sometimes strongly, with the path of that government. Of those who disagreed, some were so invested in blocking this path for one reason or another that they were willing to go to extreme lengths to do so. We must now take stock of the so-called opposition to the majority Bolshevik government leading the Soviet Union in the early 1930s. As mentioned in part 1 of this series, at the outset of the Reconstruction period, Leon Trotsky shared leadership of the so-called New Opposition with his friend from his American days, Nikolai Bukharin, and the ever-eloquent Grigory Zinoviev, who, together with Trotsky's brother-in-law Lev Kamenev, headed the Zinovievites. Trotsky was, of course, not without his own supporters, who were often enthralled by his oratory skills and steadfast ambition. They were Yuri Pyatakov, son of a wealthy Ukrainian family who had latched on to Trotsky when they were both in Western Europe before the revolution. Karl Radek, Polish journalist who, together with Trotsky, had opposed Lenin in Switzerland prior to the revolution. Nikolai Krestinsky, former lawyer and former Bolshevik representative of the pre-revolution Russian Duma. Grigory Sokolnikov, former classmate of Bukharin who received his doctorate in economics in France prior to the war, and who also contributed to Trotsky's paper Nasze Slovo while in Switzerland. He was a member of the Conciliator Bolshevik as well, who strove to reunite the Bolsheviks with the Mensheviks. After the revolution, he joined Trotsky in the Soviet Foreign Office, accompanying him on his trip to Brest-Litovsk. Christian Rakovsky, former financial backer of the Romanian Socialists, who acquired his medical doctorate in France and lived in many European countries before the revolution. He would become Soviet ambassador to England in 1924. Nikolai Muralov, commander of the Moscow military garrison, who took a liking to Trotsky during his war commissar days. Ivan Smirnov, who was Trotsky's personal bodyguard at one point, along with Sergei Merchovsky and Ephraim Dreitzer. Yakov Blumkin, who had once been a member of the left social revolutionary insurrection against the Bolsheviks during the revolution. He was the man who assassinated the German ambassador Mirbach to sabotage the Brest-Litovsk Treaty, along with Nikolai Andreev. After the revolution, he joined Felix Dzerzhinsky as head of the Cheka counter-espionage department, and then GPU before becoming friends with Trotsky at the Moscow Military College. And Mikhail Tukhachevsky, former Tsarist officer who became involved with Trotsky during the Polish campaign of the Civil War in 1920. After the debacle during the 10-year anniversary of the revolution, when Trotskyists were dumping leaflets off of the roofs of buildings, Muralov, Smirnov, Merchovsky, Dreitzer, Kamenev, Pyatakov, Zinoviev, among others, were arrested. Trotsky was exiled to the capital of the Kazakh Soviet Republic, Alma-Ata. Despite being exiled, Trotsky was given a house for him and his family, was permitted to maintain some of his bodyguard, including Dreitzer, was allowed to send and receive private mail, to have his own library, and to maintain his own confidential archives. Trotsky's son, Leon Sedov, would become an important opposition figure himself. Of his son, Trotsky wrote later,
His work in Alma-Ata was truly peerless. We called him our Minister of Foreign Affairs, Minister of Police, and Minister of Communications. And, in fulfilling all of these functions, he had to rely on an illegal apparatus. Sometimes special couriers also arrived from Moscow. Outside connections were handled entirely by Leon. He would leave the house on a rainy night, or when snow fell heavily, or, evading the vigilance of the spies, he would hide himself during the day in the library to meet the courier in a public bath, or among the thick weeds in the outskirts of town. Each time he returned happy, with a conquering gleam in his eyes and the precious booty under his clothing. Between April and October 1928, we received approximately 1,000 political letters and documents and about 700 telegrams. In the same period, we sent out 500 telegrams and not fewer than 800 political letters.
In December 1928, the Soviet government sent a representative to tell him that, due to the counter-revolutionary nature of his continued work, they would like a promise that he would stop. He refused. Taking place in January 18, 1929, minutes taken at the OGPU Special Collegium read:
The case of citizen Trotsky, Lev Davidovich, under Article 5810 of the Criminal Code, on a charge of counter-revolutionary activity expressing itself in the organization of an illegal anti-Soviet party, whose activity has been lately directed towards provoking anti-Soviet actions and preparing for an armed struggle against Soviet power. Resolved, Citizen Trotsky, Lev Davidovich, to be deported from the territory of the USSR.
Late in 1930, after a visit to Trotsky in Prinkipo, Turkey, erstwhile terrorist Blumkin was apprehended by Soviet police, put on trial, found guilty of smuggling arms and anti-Soviet propaganda into the USSR, and shot. He was the first of many to lose their lives as a result of belief in the pretender. As quoted earlier, American journalist John Gunther indicated that the center of Trotskyist agitation was Berlin. And Berlin is exactly where his son, Lev Sedov, had gone in 1931. And after a short period in exile, Trotsky's old bodyguard, Ivan Smirnov, was appointed to the Soviet Foreign Trade Commission, where he would have occasion to be consultant engineer to Berlin. Yuri Pyatakov was appointed head of All-Union Chemical Industry Association, and then Deputy People's Commissar of Heavy Industry, where he worked above Nikolai Bukharin. As early as 1931, as we covered in the show trials section, sabotage was rife in the USSR, but these weren't isolated, disjointed acts. Engineer John D. Littlepage, in a Saturday Evening Post interview published in January 1938, said,
I went to Berlin in the spring of 1931 with a large purchasing commission headed by Pyatakov. Among other things, the commission was buying several dozen mine hoists. The commission asked for quotations. After some discussions, the German firm Borsig and Demag reduced their prices between 5 and 6 pfennigs per kilogram. When I studied these proposals, I discovered that the firm had substituted cast iron bases weighing several tons for the light steel provided in the specifications, which would reduce the cost of production per kilogram, but increase the weight, and therefore the cost to Pyatakov. I reported this to the commission with a sense of triumph. The matter was arranged that Pyatakov could have gone back to Moscow and shown that he had been very successful in reducing prices, but at the same time would have paid out money for a lot of worthless cast iron and enabled the Germans to give him very substantial rebates. He got away with the same trick in some other mines, although I blocked this one.
A 1947 study having nothing to do with the aforementioned trials, dealing with Nazi Germany's use of businesses for intelligence actions, determined,
for this new type of espionage, what could be more perfectly suited than business concerns trading in all parts of the world and dealing with important technical information as a matter of daily routine? For espionage in Russia, Colonel Nikolai used firms like Borsig and Demag and Fröhlich Krupfel Delman.
Pyatakov confessed to this exact strategy, which was used to help funnel money to the opposition. We will cover this particular trial in Part 3 of the Stalin Eras. But with Trotsky deported to Turkey, all of those arrested denounced their previous deviations, which most would later admit was a calculated strategy, and rejoined the party. Bukharin had refused to engage or support Trotsky's 1927 putsch attempt, and Trotsky was not happy with this. For a while, they were opposed to one another. Bukharin was now the main leader of the opposition in secret. As far back as 1928, according to Swiss pastor, journalist, and socialist Jules Humbert-Droz, Bukharin had advocated assassination to depose Stalin. Humbert-Droz disagreed vehemently, saying that it would lead to destruction of the Bolshevik leadership. This feud ended their friendship. In 1930, Trotsky published My Life, a semi-fictitious autobiography which Western leftists and other anti-Soviets turned into a worldwide bestseller. Lord Rothermere owned the Daily Mail, Daily Mirror, and later openly supported Nazi Germany, along with the British Union of Fascists. He and American newspaper magnate / fascist supporter of Holodomor fame, William Randolph Hearst, began to label Stalin betrayer of the revolution. From there, a deluge of anti-Soviet works spewed from Trotsky's pen. The Revolution Betrayed, Soviet Economics in Danger, The Failure of the Five-Year Plan, Stalin and the Chinese Revolution, The Stalin School of Falsification. The capitalist press ate it up. Bulletin of the Opposition was printed in Turkey, then Germany, France, Norway, before being smuggled back into the USSR, aimed at diplomats, state officials, military, and intellectuals, playing on their doubts and anxieties about the rapid changes in the country. Even Trotsky admitted in Leon Sedov's Sun Fighter Friend that Sedov spent his time there trying to connect with Soviet tourists, Soviet students abroad, or sympathetic functionaries in foreign representations. In 1931, Ivan Smirnov was permitted to travel to Berlin, where he met Sedov and discussed the opposition's activities, along with his personal views on Soviet policy and rising popular discontent. Given that this was during the thick of collectivization, it is easy to see how he might feel confident in that. According to Smirnov's later testimony, after this meeting, Sedov told him that a Soviet trade mission had recently arrived in Berlin, and to inform the head of that mission that Sedov was in town and wished to speak with him. The head of that trade mission was Pyatakov, and that mission was the one from Little Page's story in the Saturday Evening Post. There were two other secret oppositionists in Berlin in 1931, Alexei Shestov, who was on Pyatakov's trade mission, and Sergei Besanov, a member of the Berlin Trade Representation who had a permanent station there. According to his later testimony, Besanov was to receive communications from the USSR, which he would then give to Sedov, who would forward them to his father if he deemed it necessary. Shestov was one of several oppositionists that were running the Trotskyist printing presses during the 10th anniversary putsch attempt in 1927. When he met Sedov in 1931, Trotsky's son asked him if he knew of German industrialist Herr Dellmann. Shestov said that he knew him by reputation only, as Dellmann was the director of the Froelich Klupfel Dellmann firm. The organization had many engineers employed in the West Siberian mines, where Shestov himself worked before getting the job with Pyatakov. Sedov told him that, aside from being very helpful in undermining the Soviet economy, Dellmann was helping them get agents into the Soviet Union. Shestov was told to supply him with information about new Siberian mines and industries in which Dellmann was interested, in exchange for these services. They were particularly concerned at the time about the construction of a new industrial base in western Siberia and the Urals, which were out of bombing range in case of war and could prove a thorn in their side. The next year brought a new player to the table, as far as espionage was concerned. The Japanese intelligence service enacted the Plan of 1932, which, according to the archival copy, intended to
organize subversive activities against the USSR, mainly through independence movements in Ukraine, Georgia, and Azerbaijan, and to seek cooperation with local intelligence services, military forces, and émigré Russian organizations in neighboring countries of the USSR, such as Estonia and Finland.
1933 also saw a change in tactics of the opposition within the USSR. According to later testimony, Karl Radek was told by Pyatakov that the conditions within the Soviet Union were such that the building of a mass movement against Stalin and the rest of the leadership was not possible anymore. In other words, the discontent with collectivization had subsided, and it would be unlikely that the opposition could convince the people to overthrow the Central Committee. That now they must discuss, quote-unquote, personal terrorism or assassination. Radek testified that he was very uncomfortable with this change and wanted confirmation from Trotsky himself before he would commit to it. He testified that he had received a personal letter from Trotsky in February or March 1932, which stated,
"You must bear in mind the experience of the preceding period and realize that, for you, there can be no returning to the past. The struggle has entered a new phase, and the new feature in this phase is that either we shall be destroyed together with the Soviet Union, or we must raise the question of removing the leadership."
At the moment, we have no way to know whether Radek was telling the truth during the trial, at least on this particular point. But Trotsky's archives, which, according to historian J.R. Getty, have been purged of much material, still contain postal imprints of a number of letters which Trotsky sent to various opposition leaders he repeatedly denied contacting. One is a personal letter to Radek, which states it was delivered on March 3rd, 1932. In November, an archival letter from Trotsky to Sedov confirms the formation of a bloc with the Trotskyists in the USSR, which he calls our group. The Zinovievites, the group of Ian Smirnov, of Sten Lomonosov, of Safarov Tarkov, the Rights, and the Liberals. It goes on to imply that the Rightists will become more involved, but Trotsky specifies that they must not yield the field to the Rightists, clearly concerned about a right-wing push for power in the event of a successful counter-revolution. In that same month, according to a summary written by Sedov, Eduard Gotzman, a friend of Smirnov, also visited Sedov, from whom he received Trotsky's approval to form a bloc with other oppositionists, and, importantly, to use various methods, including terrorism, to remove Stalin. It was 4 more years before the NKVD learned of the formation of this bloc. Mail receipts in Trotsky's archives show that from April to December of 1932, in addition to those sent to Karl Radek in Geneva, he also contacted Sokolnikov in London, Preobrazhensky, and the Ryutin Group, among others. But circumstances shifted in 1932, which would push the group to be even more careful about their communications and plotting. Members of Valentin Oberg's branch of the Communist Party of Germany broke into his office and stole all of the documents which tied them to Trotsky and Sedov, which included 14 letters from Trotsky, with copies of 14 replies to Trotsky from Oberg. There were also 43 letters and postcards to Sedov, who was of course acting as the central point of contact for the conspiracy. The party members sent them all to the Comintern, who then forwarded them to the OGPU. Oberg, who moved to the USSR in 1935, lived in his father-in-law's apartment. His father-in-law was an active member of the Nazi Party. After receiving Oberg's letters, on January 1st, 1933, Soviet police arrested Smirnov and 68 other Trotskyists. Head of the GPU, Genrikh Yagoda, reported to Stalin that officers had confiscated directives from Trotsky sent from abroad, as well as correspondence between Smirnov and other Trotskyists about maintaining contact after being readmitted to the party. Yagoda, now trying to cover his tracks, added that, looking back, Smirnov's capitulation statement contained a number of rubbery formulations in which he easily accommodates his disagreements with the party. He added that others who had signed the statements, like Smirnov's, had also continued to engage in subversive activities. 2 days later, a top-secret report to Stalin quotes a prisoner, corroborated by Ante Chiliga's memoir later, that there was a very active Trotskyist base among the people in that prison. As the confessions streamed in, another secret report on the 20th of January quoted a letter intercepted by the NKVD between Trotsky and Smirnov's group in October of 32. Yagoda conveyed, or feigned, surprise that it claimed the group had decided not to attempt to assassinate Stalin at that time. In his autobiography, which he published in 1955, Betrayal of an Idea, Grigory Tokayev wrote about a conversation he had with Bukharin at this time, who was working in the People's Commissariat of Heavy Industry under Pyatakov. Tokayev said in glowing praise of Bukharin as his former mentor,
It was in the commissariat building that we visited Bukharin, Belinsky, and I. Belinsky was not his real name. It was an undercover designation by which we all knew him. He was killed in defense of Moscow in 1941 after being, for years, active in the Komsomol in opposition to Stalin. Bukharin had welcomed us cordially. He had much to say to us and spoke with great agitation, impulsively and compellingly. What it amounted to was this: if we, younger Soviet men, men of the second generation of the revolution, did not learn to take ourselves more seriously, if we did not galvanize ourselves into activity against those who were already deforming the revolution, we would sooner or later be crushed out of existence under the roller of encroaching despotism. Bukharin wanted us to act with greater determination. We were to snatch the initiative from the hands of the Stalin, Molotov, Kirov triumvirate. We should stimulate the younger generation of workers and peasants into a movement of opposition. We should make our we, and indeed our every I, ring louder. For were we not both citizens and masters of our own country, and the legitimate heirs of the revolution?
The bloc of Rights and Trotskyites, as they came to be known, would lay low for a while, as they had too much heat on them, and Trotsky was booted from Turkey, struggling to find admission in France. But a number of other groups came to notoriety, supported overtly or covertly by the newly ascendant Nazi Party. In October 1933, the OUN in Ukraine assassinated Alex Mylov, secretary of the Soviet embassy in Lvov. In December, the Romanian Iron Guards assassinated the premier, Ion Duca. In February 1934, a French fascist group, Croix de Deux, led an uprising in Paris. In March, the Nazi-financed Liberty Fighters attempted a coup in Estonia. In May, there was a fascist coup in Bulgaria and an attempt at one in Latvia. In June, the Polish Minister of the Interior was assassinated, as was Ivan Babi, head of the Organization for Catholic Action in Poland, both by the OUN. That same month, there was an attempted mass uprising in Lithuania by the Nazi Iron Wolf organization, an attempted putsch in Austria by the Nazis, and the assassination of Austrian Chancellor Engelbert Dollfuss by Nazi terrorists came a month later. In October, the assassination of King Alexander of Yugoslavia and the French Foreign Minister Barthel by the Croatian fascist Ustashi shook Europe and the world. Back in the USSR, in December of 1934, the assassination of a well-known mid-level bureaucrat would begin the unraveling of a conspiracy so large that to this day it is hard for people to swallow its existence.
The assassination of Kirov. Here is what we know. On a chilly afternoon in the winter of 1934, Leningrad party chief Sergei Kirov entered the Smolny Institute, then headquarters of the Bolshevik Party, for the last time. He climbed 3 flights of stairs and strode towards his office. He passed party member Vasilievich Nikolaev in the hall, who waited for Kirov to get some distance away before running up behind him and putting a bullet in the back of Kirov's skull. Nikolaev then turned the gun on himself
but missed, and fainted mere feet from his victim's lifeless body. Nikolaev was taken into custody immediately. The assassin initially claimed that he acted alone, that he felt neglected by the party, and wished to bring attention to his plight via propaganda of the deed. After a few days, however, he revealed that he had been part of a conspiracy, and by the end of the week, confessed that his co-conspirators were Zinoviev supporters, acting against General Secretary Stalin. The NKVD began making arrests of Nikolaev's named accomplices, and 2 weeks later, a total of 14 men stood trial. All but 5 were individuals who had been expelled from the party by resolution at the 15th Party Congress in 1927. Between December 28th and 29th, all were convicted and executed. Nikolaev's brother and sister-in-law made a series of confessions implicating themselves in the conspiracy, and in March 1935, she was also tried and executed. But now we must move beyond what we know, because things begin to get murky. It was this particular conspiracy which led to the uncovering of many of the later conspiracies, those which became the subject of the so-called show trials of the late 1930s, the ones which we will cover in nauseating detail in episode 3, so stand by. Kirov's assassination had other consequences as well. He was, in the minds of many, a logical successor to Stalin, one of Stalin's great supporters, favored by the General Secretary. And yet, following Stalin's death in 1953, Khrushchev attempted, and failed, to pin Kirov's death on Stalin himself. When Khrushchev's cronies could not turn up the evidence from the archives or elsewhere, they instead shifted to discrediting the trials, saying that Nikolaev acted alone. This didn't stop British disinformation expert Robert Conquest from publishing an entire book about Stalin's involvement based upon hearsay, nor did it stop Gorbachev-era bureaucrats from relaunching an investigation which, again, turned up zero evidence for Stalin's involvement. More than one author has attempted to argue the lone gunman theory and has found primary source evidence to support this claim. However, these authors have been very selective in which primary sources they believe, and very selective in how they interpret those sources. They have silenced the past, which disagrees with their preconceived notion that Nikolaev acted alone. One of the difficulties in researching Kirov's assassination is that it is, curiously, one of 3 cases which the Russian government has kept mostly sealed as regards the Soviet archives, the other 2 being the Moscow trials and the Yezhovchina, known as the Great Terror in the West. Which is not to say that nothing in these cases has been declassified, only that they have not been fully declassified. It might be tempting, if you see Stalin as a villain, to assume that this is because they implicate the man as fully responsible for Kirov's death, for the show trials, and the Great Terror. But we would like to point out that at least 2 separate administrations who had access to the archives post-Stalin attempted to pin Kirov's death on Stalin and could not. We would argue that it is just as likely, if not more likely, that the opposite is true, that the archives exonerate Stalin, who is otherwise a convenient boogeyman for liberals and reactionaries alike. But this, like the arguments of those who blame Stalin, is speculation, and, well, we are materialists. Let us examine the evidence we do have. Considering that the 2 most well-cited and intensive texts on the matter, Alla Kirilina's book, Nezvetny Kirov, published in 2001, and Matthew Leno's 2010 book, The Kirov Murder and Soviet History, do not implicate Stalin, but rather point to the lone gunman theory, we can, at least until new evidence points to the contrary, put to rest the idea that Stalin was responsible. The idea that Nikolaev acted alone was the official position of the post-Khrushchev era government of the USSR, and it is the current official position of the Russian government. But, as hinted earlier, Nikolaev as lone gunman is not a foregone conclusion. There is counter-evidence. Part of the issue is that Karolina, and therefore Leno, who cites Karolina as a key source, begin with the presupposition that the Moscow trials were built on fabricated evidence and forced confessions, and then work backward from there. We can't really get into why this is a ludicrous premise. You'll just have to wait for part 3. But this is, as we have mentioned a few times before, a bad way to engage in historiography. We should examine the evidence first, and then build our conclusions upon that evidence. We should not begin with a conclusion and then build our evidence upon that conclusion. The two authors also hold the preconception that Nikolaev acted alone, and that is strike 2. Let us begin with a pretty obvious misstep on Karolina's part. When addressing Soviet prosecutor Andrei Vyshinsky, who presided over the Moscow trials and assisted on the Kirov trials, she says that Vyshinsky believed that, quote, confession is the queen of evidence, end quote. Her source is a newspaper article published in 2000. Now, whether she selected this source because it was convenient or because she knew it was misleading is unknowable. What we do know is that Vyshinsky gave a speech to the Central Committee in 1937 specifically attacking the use of confessions above more reliable evidence. Further, in 1946, he published a book, The Theory of Trial Evidence in Soviet Law, in which he directly criticizes the Renaissance-era practice of uncritical acceptance of confessions, even those elicited via torture, as the queen of proofs. This is likely the source of the aforementioned newspaper article's misquote. Karolina goes on to say that none of Nikolaev's supposed co-conspirators named him explicitly as part of a Leningrad insurgent cell operating on behalf of Zinoviev. But this is a lie. According to Matthew Leno himself, on December 12, 1934, Zvezdov lists 8 individuals as active participants, the last of which is Leonid Nikolaev. Another concern is that of Nikolaev's supposed motivations. If he was indeed acting alone, why did he do it? We must first remember that unemployment had been almost completely obliterated during the first 5-year plan. But Nikolaev was one of the exceptions. He claims that, having fallen on hard times, he felt like the party had abandoned him, and so he felt he must take the drastic action of assassinating one of its leaders. Why Kirov? Why not Zinoviev, who was Kirov's then boss? This is not clear. What is clear is that, in spite of being out of work, Nikolaev lived a fairly comfortable life. He had worked a series of well-paid jobs, the last of which was with the Institute of Party History, from which he was let go in April of 1934. He lived in a 3-room apartment with his family inside of a cooperative house. He and his family had their basic needs met because his wife was working and received a decent wage. They were able to afford milk, butter, eggs, clothing, and shoes. Nikolaev even owned a bicycle, which may sound like a minor detail, but in the Soviet Union in 1934, this was in all practicality a luxury item. Remember that 1934 was the first year the USSR ran a surplus. And from the beginning of 1933 until the end of summer 1934, the family even rented a private country house. In case you were wondering, this accounting of his conditions was provided by his mother. Perhaps he was simply feeling emasculated at having to defer to his wife as provider. Maybe that was enough for him to murder a man? Or perhaps he was choosing not to work, not to look for work, as this gave him more time to plan the assassination. This, by the way, is what both he and his wife state directly during their respective confessions. And December 1st was not Nikolaev's first attempt. He tried at least twice before, according to his diary, and even more times, according to his confession. When we said that Khrushchev's men did not find any evidence of Stalin's involvement in Kirov's assassination, we are afraid that wasn't the entire story. They, in fact, destroyed records which supported a conspiracy. In January of 1956, Khrushchev, knowing that he was soon to give his secret speech, and fearing that Molotov might counter Khrushchev's accusations against Stalin by releasing evidence from the archives, the new First Secretary ordered his men to burn all documents related to the case file Svoyaki. While we do not know precisely what was contained therein, based on the dates associated, as well as the entries of the personal diaries of Khrushchev and his associate, Serov, we can safely assume these were directly related to the activities of Zinovьevite agitators. And you don't have to take our word for it. This information comes directly from Matthew Leno. While this is not direct evidence of a conspiracy involving Nikolaev, in 1932, a year and a half before Kirov's assassination, the bloc between the oppositionists had been established. Notably, according to Serov himself, Zinovievites were a core part of this bloc. In the 1930s, whether or not Nikolaev was a part of the conspiracy against Stalin, there was a conspiracy against Stalin. It did not end in 1927. This is, of course, both evidence that the Moscow trials were genuine and is corroborated by the so-described false confessions given during those trials. In 1935, Zinoviev admits that there was an anti-Stalin bloc devoted to himself, not during any trial, but in an, at the time, unpublished essay. He does not go so far as to say that the members of this bloc are intent on acts of terror, rather, that these are simply like-minded comrades, so principled that they cannot give up the fight. So, what can we say with absolute certainty? Well, not much. Can we be absolutely sure that Nikolaev conspired with Zinovievites to kill Kirov? No. Can we be absolutely sure that Nikolaev acted alone? No again. But whether he did or not, we can be sure that Zinovievites and Trotskyites were actively conspiring against Stalin and his government. Whether we ascribe the various acts of terror which ramped up in the mid-1930s to random, unguided violence, or as directed from on high by Trotsky, Zinoviev, and Kamenev, will be the next major controversy. But that will have to wait for another day.
That about does it for this episode of the Stalin Eras. We want to thank all of our listeners and Patreon subscribers. The newest ones are Jacob, Danny Duplex, Andrew, Nada, Michael, Nanyo, Hackerboy Tellum, Christian, Daniel, Bob, Scott, Ben, Lazar Kaganovich, Relativity, Victor, Nate, Comrade Kale, Jabanez, Dan, George, Axel, Emma, Andre, Dylan, and Big Nasty.
And a special shout out to our only current Vanguard subscriber, Comrade Chihuahua. If you'd like to subscribe, you can do so at patreon.com/prolespod for free. If you have questions, comments, or episode ideas, please email us prolespod@outlook.com. Please follow, review, like, all that algorithm stuff. May the Spectre haunt your streets, and solidarity forever.
Stalin was a mighty man, and a mighty man was he. He led the Soviet people on the road to victory. And he has a mighty plan. He's harnessed nature to the plow to work for the good of man. He's hammered out the future, the fortune he has been, and he's made the workers' state the best the world has ever seen.